Scott Rothstein wanted you to believe the story that the pictures on the walls of his office told. There he is, shaking hands with George W. Bush. Another is with Jeb Bush, the governor of Florida. Palin, Sarah, Schwarzenegger, Arnold, Senators Arlen Specter, John McCain, and Joe Lieberman. They were all grinning. They were all delighted to be pictured with the rising star lawyer from Fort Lauderdale. Scott Rothstein had breathtaking views of the Atlantic Ocean and Las Olas Boulevard from his glass-walled office on the 16th floor of the Bank of America building. He oversaw one of the fastest-growing legal practices in Florida, 70 attorneys, 150 workers, offices in New York City, Tallahassee, West Palm Beach, Miami, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, and even Caracas, Venezuela. And it was all based on false information. When federal agents eventually raided his empire in 2009, they found one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. $1.5 billion. That's billion with a B. Fraudulent settlements of lawsuits. Falsified court records. The signatures of judges were falsified. In certain instances, individuals even pose as judges in order to give the scam the appearance of legitimacy. Scott Rothstein was not a simple money thief. He did it in style. 4 Ferraris, $1.6 million each for 2 Bugatti Veyrons, a trio of Lamborghini Murcielagos, a Bentley, a Rolls-Royce in silver. Scott Rothstein apparently felt that ordinary garages were insufficient for his collection of 20 vehicles, so he kept them all in his own air-conditioned warehouse. Oh, and he also had an 87-foot yacht, a Boeing 727 private jet, a watch collection of over 100 pieces, and in his Fort Lauderdale mansion, gold-plated toilet seats, $25,000. Each one of Rothstein's investors later told a reporter, "I was lulled into believing this myth that he created. I really believed he had a golden touch. What better way to perpetuate that myth than by having a golden toilet?" If you're enjoying this story of one of Florida's most audacious fraudsters, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these true crime stories. And stick around, because this gets even crazier. Scott Rothstein wasn't born into wealth. He grew up in the Bronx, New York. His father, Harvey, was a door-to-door salesman. Not exactly the background you'd expect for someone who'd eventually rub shoulders with governors and senators. But Rothstein had ambition. And he had something else, an ability to make people believe in him. He became a lawyer and eventually made his way to Florida. In the late 90s, he was practicing labor and employment law. Nothing flashy, nothing that suggested what was coming. In 1999, he partnered with Stuart Rosenfeld at a Hollywood, Florida law firm. 2 years later, in 2001, they left to start their own firm, Rothstein and Rosenfeld. The firm did well. They brought in Russell Adler as a partner, and it became Rothstein, Rosenfeld, and Adler. People called it RRA. Over the next 7 years, the firm exploded in size. They went from a handful of lawyers to 70 attorneys and 150 employees. They had offices across Florida and beyond. They handled labor disputes, civil rights cases, intellectual property, personal injury, commercial litigation. By the mid-2000s, Scott Rothstein was a name in South Florida. He donated heavily to political campaigns, mostly Republicans. Charlie Crist, Florida's governor, was a close friend. Rothstein raised millions for Crist and for John McCain's presidential campaign. At Miami Dolphins games, Rothstein's name was announced as a sponsor. Huge billboards around Fort Lauderdale showed Rothstein with football legend Dan Marino. "You couldn't go anywhere here without hearing this guy's name or seeing his image," said Bob Norman, a local journalist who'd been investigating Rothstein since 2008. Norman was one of the few people asking questions early on, because to Norman, Rothstein's rise didn't make sense. The way Norman saw it, Rothstein's rise to power in South Florida happened too quickly, Norman later explained. Rothstein had grown his law firm from 5 lawyers in 2005 to 70 lawyers and 150 staff members by 2009. That's explosive growth. And the money Rothstein was spending? It didn't add up. He didn't have one Bentley, he had 3 Bentleys. He had 20 luxury cars he kept in an air-conditioned warehouse, Norman said. Everyone in town was looking at him and asking, where is he getting all this money? He's a lawyer, and even the most successful lawyer in this town wasn't throwing around the money that he was. But people wanted to believe, because Scott Rothstein was more than just a successful lawyer. He was a philanthropist. He donated generously to charities. His name appeared on buildings. He threw lavish parties. He made people feel important. And when you're sitting in a room with someone who has photos of themselves with the President of the United States, you tend to think they're legitimate. That's exactly what Rothstein was counting on. The scheme itself was deceptively simple. Rothstein told investors that his law firm, RRA, specialized in sexual harassment and whistleblower cases. Big corporations, he explained, were terrified of these cases going public. The bad publicity could destroy them, so they were willing to pay enormous settlements to make the cases go away quietly. Here's where Rothstein's pitch got interesting. He said that these settlements were confidential, pre-litigation, meaning they happened before any lawsuit was even filed. The corporate defendant would agree to pay the victim a large sum of money over time, maybe $1 million paid out over several years. But what if the victim needed money now? What if they couldn't wait years for their settlement payments? That's where the investors came in. Rothstein told them they could buy these settlement agreements at a discount. The corporation would pay $1 million over time, but you could buy the settlement for, say, $800,000 cash right now. Then, as the corporation made payments, you'd get your full $1 million back. A 25% return on investment in just a few years. Safe, secured by the corporation's obligation to pay. Completely confidential. It sounded perfect. Too perfect. Because it was completely fake. There were no victims. There were no settlements. There were no corporations paying out millions. Rothstein was creating false documents, fake settlement agreements, forged court orders. In some cases, he even had people pose as judges to meet with investors and make everything look legitimate. One of his attorneys, David Bowden, would later serve 18 months in prison for his role in the scheme. Bowden was present for many of the investor pitches. He explained Rothstein's formula. Someone with a net worth of $10 million was willing to pay $2 million in cash to pay off their mistress. The key, Bowden said, was the promise of confidentiality. Rich people would pay anything to keep scandals quiet. It was brilliant psychology. Rothstein wasn't just selling an investment. He was selling a story that made sense. Of course, wealthy executives would pay to avoid public humiliation. Of course, these cases had to stay confidential. Of course, you couldn't verify the details because confidentiality agreements prevented it. Rothstein told investors that RRA was the preeminent sexual harassment law firm in the country. He showed them documents that looked official, bank statements that appeared to show millions in trust accounts, settlement agreements with real-looking signatures, court orders on official-looking letterhead, and he had help. Lawyers who created false opinion letters claiming to represent investment groups. Lawyers who drafted fake documents and negotiated final papers with investors' attorneys. Even some local police officers were allegedly on Rothstein's payroll, providing security and lending an air of legitimacy to the operation. Rothstein's security setup was elaborate. Anyone entering his suite of offices had to use an intercom. He had a hidden elevator for private exits. Dozens of surveillance cameras and microphones throughout the office. His security team consisted of off-duty Fort Lauderdale police officers. So many that 2 police officials were required to coordinate them. These officers guarded his home, his restaurant, and his law firm. Some high-ranking police supervisors were paid 5.5% of the total security budget each week. Think about that. When you walked into Scott Rothstein's office, you saw police officers providing security. That sends a message. This man is important. This man is legitimate. This man is protected by law enforcement. Of course, those officers had no idea they were providing security for one of the biggest frauds in Florida history. The scheme worked exactly like every Ponzi scheme works. New investors' money was used to pay off old investors. If you invested early and got paid back with your promised returns, you'd tell your friends. You'd become Rothstein's best salesman. This guy's legitimate. I made 25% on my investment in 2 years. You should invest too. And so more people invested. And Rothstein used their money to pay the earlier investors. And the cycle continued, growing larger, more investors, more money, more luxury cars, more yachts, more political donations, more charitable contributions, all designed to create the illusion of massive success. But Ponzi schemes have a fatal flaw. They require constant growth. You need new money coming in to pay the old money going out. The moment new investments slow down, the whole thing collapses. Rothstein knew this, so he kept spending, kept donating, kept buying cars and boats and planes. Because all of that spending created more legitimacy. When people saw him at charity galas or political fundraisers, when they saw his name on buildings or his cars on the street, they thought, this man is successful. This man can be trusted. By 2009, Rothstein owned 15 real estate properties. His primary residence was a $6.5 million waterfront mansion in Fort Lauderdale's exclusive Harbor Beach neighborhood. He also owned a $2.8 million oceanfront estate in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and a $6 million condo in New York City, plus a share of Casa Casuarina in Miami Beach, the former mansion of fashion designer Gianni Versace. He owned the Bova Prime restaurant in Fort Lauderdale, part of a technology company called Q-Task, a piece of V. Giorgio Spirits Company, a share of Renato Watch Company. He was working on opening a cigar and martini bar on Las Olas Boulevard and developing 2 high-rise residential buildings in Brooklyn. The man was everywhere, doing everything, and spending money like it would never run out, except it did run out, because that's what happens with Ponzi schemes. Always. In 2008, Bob Norman started writing articles questioning Rothstein's wealth. Where was all this money coming from? How does a labor and employment lawyer afford this lifestyle? Norman's articles planted seeds of doubt. People started asking questions. By mid-2009, some investors were getting nervous. They'd been promised returns, but payments were delayed. Rothstein had excuses, problems with the settlements, delays in corporate payments, the usual Ponzi scheme stall tactics. But some investors weren't satisfied. They wanted their money. Now. Rothstein needed more time, more investors, more money to keep the scheme alive. He started getting desperate. The pressure was building. The questions were getting louder. And in October 2009, everything started to unravel. Rothstein had been communicating with other lawyers, asking which countries didn't extradite criminal suspects to the United States or Israel. Several lawyers mentioned Morocco. On October 26, 2009, Scott Rothstein wired $16 million to an individual in Casablanca. Then he got on a plane. He left without his wife, Kimberly. He left without telling most of his law partners what was happening. He just disappeared. 4 days later, on October 31, 2009, his partners received a text message. It read, "Sorry for letting you all down. I am a fool. I thought I could fix it, but got trapped by my ego and refusal to fail. And now all I have accomplished is hurting the people I love. Please take care of yourselves and please protect Kimmy. She knew nothing. Neither did she, nor any of you deserve what I did. I hope God allows me to see you on the other side. Love, Scott." It was a suicide note, sent by text message from Morocco. Back in Fort Lauderdale, chaos erupted. The law firm's employees were confused, terrified. What was happening? Where was their boss? Was he dead? And what did he mean by what I did? Stuart Rosenfeld, Rothstein's law partner, started sending text messages to Morocco. Urgent messages. "Choose life," he texted. "Come back. We can fix this." For days, nobody knew if Scott Rothstein was alive or dead. Rumors swirled through South Florida. The FBI started investigating. Investors started panicking. The law firm was in chaos. And then, on November 3rd, 2009, 8 days after he'd fled, Scott Rothstein returned to Fort Lauderdale. He flew back on a chartered jet. Not because he'd had a change of heart. Not because he wanted to face justice. But because he'd figured out that Morocco wouldn't protect him the way he'd hoped. When he landed, federal agents were waiting. When Scott Rothstein's chartered jet touched down in Fort Lauderdale on November 3rd, 2009, he knew his life as he'd known it was over. The $16 million he'd wired to Morocco? Useless. The suicide text? Embarrassing. The 8-day escape attempt? A complete failure. Federal agents were already building their case, and what they found was staggering. On November 9th, 2009, FBI and IRS agents descended on Rothstein's $6.5 million waterfront mansion in Harbor Beach. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the raid live. Agents in windbreakers carried box after box out of the house. Documents, financial records, computers, and then the really interesting stuff started coming out. Boxes of expensive cigars from the yacht docked behind the house. Bottles of wine. What appeared to be weapons and shotguns. And then the cars. Oh, the cars. Agents seized a Bentley from the driveway, a Rolls-Royce. They took the yacht right off the dock behind his house, crews from National Liquidators towing it away while cameras rolled. Neighbors stood outside watching, some shocked, some satisfied. Everyone wondering how much of this was bought with stolen money. The answer? All of it. Over the following days, federal agents seized $60 million worth of assets just in the initial sweep. 20 luxury automobiles, 15 real estate properties across multiple states. That 87-foot yacht, the Miss Kimberly, named after his wife. 304 pieces of jewelry, watches, necklaces, and earrings from his home. Bank accounts in the United States and overseas, including that $12 million stashed in Moroccan banks. They even seized assets from the Euro Motorsports dealership, where Rothstein kept some of his car collection, a 2010 Lamborghini LP670 SV, a 2008 Bugatti Veyron, a 2009 Bentley Continental GTC, a 2008 Ferrari 430 Spider, a 2007 Rolls-Royce Phantom, each one worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Together, millions. On December 1st, 2009, exactly 1 month after returning from Morocco, Scott Rothstein was formally arrested on federal fraud charges. He faced 5 counts of racketeering and fraud. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to 100 years in federal prison. Acting U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Sloman didn't mince words at the press conference announcing the charges. He spent his client's money on real estate, cars, yachts, politics, and philanthropy, all to create the illusion that he was hugely successful, Sloman said. Instead, he has potentially bought himself a lengthy prison sentence. The charges were detailed and damning. Prosecutors alleged that Rothstein had run the scheme from his Fort Lauderdale office for approximately 4 to 5 years, that his victims included his own friends and clients, that he'd used corrupt law enforcement officials, forged federal court documents, forged judges' signatures, and convinced others to pose as judges to make the fake settlements look legitimate. The FBI's investigation revealed just how elaborate the fraud had been. In some cases, Rothstein had defrauded actual clients of RRA. The law firm would file a legitimate lawsuit on behalf of real plaintiffs. Then, without the client's knowledge, RRA would settle the lawsuit in favor of the defendant. This obligated the clients to pay $500,000 to the defendant. To hide this fraud, Rothstein and his co-conspirators created false federal court orders, complete with forged signatures of U.S. District Court judges. Think about that. He stole from his own clients, people who'd hired him to represent them, who trusted him with their legal cases. And he settled their cases against them and stuck them with bills they didn't know they owed. But the bulk of the fraud came from the fake settlement investment scheme. Prosecutors estimated that Rothstein had solicited investments from clients ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. He told them the money would be held in RRA's trust accounts, safe, secured, guaranteed by corporate settlement payments that would come over time. None of it existed. The investment vehicles were completely fabricated, part of what prosecutors called an elaborate Ponzi scheme in which new investors' money was used to repay money owed to earlier investors. To make it work, Rothstein and his co-conspirators had used multiple bank accounts at TD Bank, Gibraltar Private Bank and Trust, and other financial institutions. They created false bank documents, false online bank account information, false settlement agreements and promissory notes, all shown to investors as proof that the money existed. A group of investors later filed a lawsuit alleging that TD Bank had helped Rothstein run his scheme. They sought over $100 million in damages from the Canadian banking firm. Their lawyer, William Scherer, told reporters, "The Ponzi scheme would never have worked without the bank's cooperation and blind eye of the senior management at TD Bank to what was going on there, given the tremendous amount of my client's money that was flowing through trust accounts in that bank." The allegations against TD Bank were serious. How does that much money flow through accounts without triggering red flags? How do you not notice when settlement payments that should be coming from corporations never actually arrive? Either the bank was complicit, or they were criminally negligent. Either way, investors argued TD Bank should be held accountable. Rothstein's attorney, Mark Nurek, tried to put a positive spin on things. "Scott is a strong individual and he's accepting this like a man," Nurek told reporters. "At the end of the day, the people who deserve to get money will get money back. Scott feels very remorseful." Remorseful or not, Rothstein knew he was caught. The evidence was overwhelming, so on January 27, 2010, he appeared in federal court and changed his plea. Instead of fighting the charges, he pleaded guilty to 5 federal crimes: 1 count of conspiracy to violate the RICO statute, 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering, and 3 counts of wire fraud and mail fraud. Judge Robin S. Rosenbaum denied him bond. She ruled that due to his demonstrated ability to forge documents and his recent attempt to flee to Morocco, Rothstein was a flight risk. He was sent to the federal detention center in Miami to await sentencing. As part of his guilty plea, Rothstein admitted everything. He admitted running a scheme from approximately 2005 to 2009. He admitted creating fake settlement agreements and forged documents. He admitted using his position as a lawyer and RRA's reputation to lure investors. He admitted using new investors' money to pay off old investors in a classic Ponzi scheme structure. And he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, fully, which meant naming names, identifying co-conspirators, testifying against anyone who'd helped him run the fraud. This cooperation was crucial because Rothstein hadn't acted alone. Over the next several years, prosecutors would bring charges against nearly 30 defendants connected to the scheme. Lawyers who'd helped create false documents, business partners who'd facilitated investments, associates who'd sold the fake settlements for commissions. David Bowden, the lawyer who'd helped pitch investors, pleaded guilty and received 18 months in prison. Douglas Bates, another attorney who'd drafted false opinion letters, got 60 months. Richard Pearson, who'd received sales commissions, faced charges. George Levin of Banyan Income Fund was implicated. Even TD Bank employees eventually faced scrutiny. The investigation spread like wildfire. Anyone who touched Rothstein's operation was potentially culpable, and Rothstein was talking, giving prosecutors everything they wanted: names, dates, details, bank accounts, document locations. He was trying to earn a reduction in his sentence by cooperating extensively. But first, he had to be sentenced for his own crimes. On June 9, 2010, Scott Rothstein appeared before U.S. District Judge James Cohn for sentencing. The courtroom was packed. Investors who'd lost everything, former employees of RRA who'd lost their jobs, media from across the country. Everyone wanted to see what would happen to Florida's Minnie Madoff. Prosecutors had recommended 40 years. Rothstein's attorneys had argued for 30 years, citing his cooperation and remorse. Judge Cohn had other ideas. Before pronouncing sentence, Rothstein had the opportunity to speak. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he told the court. He talked about his cooperation with investigators, about his desire to help victims recover their money, about his regret. Judge Cohn wasn't impressed. He sentenced Scott Rothstein to 50 years in federal prison, 10 years more than prosecutors had requested, 20 years more than Rothstein had hoped for. U.S. Attorney Wilfredo Ferrer issued a statement describing Rothstein's rags to riches to jail saga as a humbling reminder of what can happen when greed and ambition run amok. He said, "Today's sentence punishes the defendant for his thievery, and hopefully brings some sense of justice to the victims of this massive fraud." 50 years. Rothstein was 47 years old. 50 years meant he'd be 97 when released. It was essentially a life sentence. He was immediately taken into custody. Due to his cooperation agreement and the threats he potentially faced from people he'd testified against, Rothstein was placed in the Witness Protection Program. His inmate number was removed from the Federal Bureau of Prisons Locator webpage. He was moved to an undisclosed location. Somewhere in America, Scott Rothstein sits in a federal prison under a different identity, serving out his sentence far from the South Florida sun. But his story didn't end with sentencing. Because the government still had work to do, they had to liquidate his assets and try to recover money for victims. On June 3, 2010, just days before Rothstein's sentencing, Rick Levin and Associates held a massive auction at the Broward County Convention Center. The items up for bid? Rothstein's toys. The 87-foot yacht Miss Kimberly was the star attraction. Bidding started strong. When the hammer finally fell, it sold for $2.5 million. A 55-foot Sea Ray Dancer went on the block. A 33-foot Aquariva Super. Jet skis. Smaller boats. Each one bringing in money that would eventually go to victims. Then came the cars. The 2010 Lamborghini LP670SV, the 2008 Bugatti Veyron, the 2009 Bentley Continental GTC, the 2008 Ferrari 430 Spider, the 2007 Rolls-Royce Phantom. Collectors and curiosity seekers bid enthusiastically. When it was over, the auction of all the watercraft and cars had brought in $5.8 million. But that was just the beginning. The government continued selling Rothstein's properties. The $6.5 million Fort Lauderdale mansion eventually sold for $5.1 million in 2014. The Rhode Island estate, the New York condo, his share of Casa Casuarina, his interest in restaurants and businesses, everything was liquidated. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, do me a quick favor and tap that like button. It helps the algorithm show these true crime stories to more people. And trust me, we're not done yet. Court documents filed by federal authorities sought forfeiture of the full $1.2 billion Rothstein had fraudulently obtained. Prosecutors noted that the money had been used to fund and operate RRA, to make contributions to federal, state, and local political candidates, and generous donations to public and private charitable institutions. Those political donations became a massive scandal in themselves. Charlie Crist, Florida's governor and Rothstein's close friend, had to answer questions about the money he'd received. At one charity auction, a photograph of Crist and Rothstein in a happy embrace, signed, "Scott, you're amazing," sold for $2,100. Crist claimed he had no idea Rothstein was running a fraud. John McCain's campaign had received donations from Rothstein, so had numerous local politicians. All of them suddenly had to distance themselves from the man they'd been happy to pose with just months earlier. The organizations that had benefited from Rothstein's contributions were confronted with moral conundrums. Do they have to give the money back? To whom? The money had been donated to charitable causes years prior. How can funds that have already been spent be returned? The situation was dire for the investors. Numerous people had invested their entire life savings in Rothstein's plan. A few had their retirement accounts liquidated, properties that were sold, owed money secured by their houses, all on the pretext that they were investing in safe, secure ventures that were supported by corporate settlement commitments. I was lulled into believing this myth that he created, one investor told reporters. I really believed he had a golden touch. Bob Norman, the journalist who'd questioned Rothstein's wealth from the start, put it perfectly. It's like Madoff, but on crack. He did it a whole lot faster and a whole lot wilder. And Norman was right. Bernie Madoff's scheme had run for decades, slowly and methodically. Rothstein's burned hot and fast. 4 or 5 years of explosive growth. Luxury on top of luxury. Spending money like it was on fire. Creating a spectacle that attracted attention and, ultimately, suspicion. Over the following years, as Rothstein cooperated with prosecutors from his undisclosed prison location, more defendants were convicted. The cases dragged on. Civil lawsuits continued. Investors fought to recover what they could. But in 2016, something happened that shocked everyone. Federal prosecutors filed a motion to withdraw their offer to reduce Rothstein's sentence based on his cooperation. Why? Because, prosecutors said, Rothstein had provided false material information to the government and violated the terms of his plea agreement. In other words, he'd lied. Even while supposedly cooperating, Scott Rothstein couldn't help himself. He'd given false information during the investigation. He'd violated his plea agreement, and as a result, any chance of reducing his 50-year sentence vanished. Defense attorneys who'd dealt with Rothstein weren't surprised. I'm not surprised that the government withdrew its motion for a sentence reduction based on the extent of lies Rothstein told about my client, said Miami attorney Sam Rabin, who'd represented one of the co-defendants. Scott Rothstein, it seemed, was still lying, still manipulating, still trying to game the system even from prison. Some habits die hard. Rothstein's attorney tried to fight back. He filed motions arguing that Rothstein deserved a sentence reduction because he'd voluntarily returned from Morocco, because he'd cooperated extensively, because victims had eventually been made whole through asset sales and forfeiture. The motion asked the court to hold a hearing so prosecutors would have to detail exactly what Rothstein had lied about. Judge Cohn ultimately sided with prosecutors. The 50-year sentence would stand. No reduction, no reward for cooperation. Scott Rothstein would serve every day of those 50 years, minus whatever good time credits he earned. He'd be in his 90s when released, if he lived that long. As of 2025, Scott Rothstein is still in federal prison, somewhere under witness protection. His exact location unknown, his life unrecognizable from the days when he flew on private jets and drove Bugattis and dined with senators. The law firm he built, Rothstein Rosenfeld Adler, is defunct, closed. 70 lawyers out of work. 150 employees suddenly unemployed, all because their boss was running a billion-dollar fraud from the 16th floor. His wife, Kimberly, who'd been a bartender before marrying Rothstein, lost everything: the mansion, the cars, the jewelry. She later faced her own legal troubles related to hiding assets, though she maintained she'd known nothing about her husband's scheme. That suicide text he'd sent from Morocco specifically said she knew nothing. Whether that was true or Rothstein protecting her, we may never know. The investors? Many of them did eventually get compensated, at least partially. The aggressive asset seizures and sales recovered hundreds of millions of dollars. Some victims were made whole, others got a fraction of what they'd lost, and some, despite everything, still lost money. Fort Lauderdale's legal and business community was left reeling. How had this happened? How had one lawyer in just a few years built such an elaborate fraud right under everyone's noses? How had he fooled so many smart people? The answer is simpler than you'd think. Scott Rothstein understood human psychology. He knew that people want to believe in success stories, that they're attracted to winners, that wealth creates its own credibility. Every Ferrari he bought, every yacht he owned, every political fundraiser he hosted, it all created the illusion of legitimacy. And the confidentiality angle was brilliant. By telling investors that these settlement agreements had to remain secret, he'd created a built-in explanation for why they couldn't verify anything. Of course, you can't see the actual clients. Confidentiality agreement. Of course, you can't see the corporate payment records. Privacy concerns. Of course, you can't talk to the judges who signed the orders. Judicial ethics. It was a scam wrapped in a layer of legitimate-sounding excuses. U.S. Attorney Wilfredo Ferrer summed it up. Rothstein manipulated and abused the trust of all whom he knew: his friends, family, business partners, legal colleagues, political figures, and even charitable organizations, to enhance his reputation, standing, and power in the community. All that he had accomplished crashed and burned when his elaborate Ponzi scheme fell apart. FBI Special Agent in Charge, John V. Gillies, added, "For those that are entrusted with other people's money, do the right thing. For those that entrust people with their money, don't be fooled by the promise of unrealistic returns." That's the lesson here. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. 25% returns with no risk? Secured by confidential settlements nobody can verify? Red flags everywhere. But when the person selling you the opportunity has photos with the president, drives a Bugatti, and is friends with the governor, you want to believe. Scott Rothstein counted on that. He built his entire fraud on the principle that people trust success, that they trust wealth, that they trust credentials and connections and appearances, and for 4 years it worked perfectly, until it didn't. Today, if you walk past the Bank of America building in downtown Fort Lauderdale, you can look up at the 16th floor where RRA used to be. Those glass-walled offices with spectacular views are occupied by someone else now. The hidden elevator and surveillance cameras are probably still there, relics of Rothstein's paranoid security operation. The Bova Prime restaurant he owned is long closed. The air-conditioned warehouse where he stored 20 luxury cars is housing someone else's vehicles. The Harbor Beach mansion has new owners who probably never mentioned the previous resident who had gold-plated toilets. Scott Rothstein's name has been scrubbed from charitable buildings. His photos with politicians have been taken down from walls. The billboards showing him with Dan Marino are gone. It's like he never existed, except in court documents and cautionary tales. $1.2 billion, 50 years in prison, nearly 30 co-defendants convicted, countless lives disrupted, an entire law firm destroyed, political careers tarnished, charities questioned, all because one lawyer from the Bronx decided that being legitimately successful wasn't enough. He wanted to be spectacularly, impossibly, fraudulently rich, and for a few years he was. He flew on private jets and drove cars that cost more than most people's homes. He rubbed shoulders with the powerful and famous. He lived a life most people can only imagine. Then he lost it all, and now he's in a federal prison somewhere in America, serving a 50-year sentence with nothing but memories of gold-plated toilets and Ferraris and yachts named after his wife. Was it worth it? You'd have to ask Scott Rothstein, but something tells me you already know the answer.